Hello chess friends. Today, Magnus Carlsen against Timur Rajabov at Vikan Z, and on move 31 Magnus throws a knight at a king he has not attacked once. Watch till the end, because the piece he gives away is not the reason he wins. Now, the game. Pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to b5, knight to f6. 4 moves, and you already know the name of all of them. This is the Berlin, and every person in that hall came to watch Magnus grind somebody to dust in the Berlin endgame. So he plays pawn to d3 instead. His bishop still looks at the knight on c6, his new pawn holds e4 from underneath, his knight touches e5, his dark bishop has the whole road from c1 to h6. He owns d5 and f5. He keeps both bishops, and there is no theory left on this board. Bishop to c5, the best square in the position. Nobody takes on e5 here, because one landing on d4 would hit 2 things at once, and f2 is one of them. The bishop already sees f2, the knight on f6 sees e4, the knight on c6 covers d4 and holds e5 behind it, and the white pawn owns d5. Rajabov puts the bishop there and dares him. Stop here, because there is a free pawn on this board and hundreds of players have taken it. Many of you might think about taking the knight on c6 first and then eating that pawn on e5. Let me show you this variation, what will happen if white collects it. Bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, knight takes the pawn. A whole free pawn in the middle of the board on move 6, and nothing defends it. I have checked this position, and it loses a piece by force. Queen to d4. No check, no capture, and e5 and f2 are both hanging at once. And here, many might think move the knight back to f3 and save it. Let me show you this too. Running a piece to safety is the most human move there is. Knight to f3, and queen takes on f2. That is mate. She is not grabbing a loose pawn, the bishop that went to c5 on move 4 is holding her there, straight through d4 and e3. The king has d2 and she covers both, she sits next to him on f2, g1 is hers as well. The piece he rescued watches it happen from f3. Let us go back to the alternative variation. So the bishop comes to e3, the queen takes the knight, the bishops come off, the queen recaptures, queen to d2, bishop to e6, knight to c3, and black castles long. -3.5, and remember how it was refuted. Not a check and not a capture, one move to d4 asked a question nobody could answer. White keeps a king stuck in the middle, a pawn on d3 that the rook on d8 already stares through, a black queen pointing at f2, a bishop on e6 running down to a2, and a knight hitting e4. Genghis Khan never broke the walls down either. He made sure nobody could leave. And now, back to the main game. So Magnus castles. Pawn to d6, and here is your second alternative, and this one is not a trap. Many of you might think about the ordinary move, pawn to c3 and pawn to d4, the way every book tells you to. Let me show you this variation, what will happen if white plays the main line. Pawn to c3, bishop back to b6, rook to e1, he castles, pawn to h3, knight to e7, pawn to d4, pawn to d5, knight takes on e5, knight takes on e4, and the other knight comes to d2. 2/10 of a pawn, and that is the entire result. Pawns come off in the center, the knight that grabbed on e4 has to drop back to d6 because the rook on e1 looks straight through it, the bishop steps to d3, the knight eyes c6, and my evaluation has not moved since move 1. This is the game you will get at your club on a Tuesday night, and it is not why Magnus came to Vikan Z. And now, back to the main game. Knight to d2 instead, and he castles. Now bishop takes knight. Magnus gives up the bishop pair on purpose, and he buys one permanent thing with it. The bishop hits b7 on the way in, the knight on f3 still touches e5, the knight on d2 is already booked for f1, the dark bishop keeps its diagonal. Pawn takes bishop, and there it is, 2 pawns on the c-file, 3 pawn islands, and a queenside that can never be repaired. 2 bishops are the fair price. One looks at a6 and down the long light road to h3, the other hits f2, the knight covers e4. 2 pawns on one file are 2 men sharing one umbrella, and you can see that both of them get wet. Pawn to h3. Nothing happens, and that is the point, the knight is never coming to g4 now, and one move has bought 20 moves of quiet. The knight still watches e5, the bishop still watches h6, the rook steps to e1 next. Rajabov answers with pawn to h6 for the same reason, so the bishop can never come to g5. Rook to e1, behind the pawn on e4, knight on e5 duty, bishop on the long dark road. Rook to e8. 2 of the best players alive, each spending a move on a threat neither of them was going to make. Knight to f1, and watch this piece, because it takes the longest walk of the game. From b1 to d2 to f1, and next it goes to g3, and from there it wants f5 and h5. The rook holds the e-file, the knight holds e5, the bishop holds the diagonal. Pawn to a5. Rajabov grabs space where his pawns are ruined, and that is the right instinct. If your structure is bad, make your squares good. His rook backs the pawn up, his bishop still hits f2, his knight still hits e4. Knight to g3, touching f5 and h5, the other knight still on e5 duty, and the rook still behind the e-pawn. Rook to b8, pointing down the half-open file at b2, bishop still on f2, knight still on e4, and his last bishop still asleep on the long diagonal. Pawn to b3, and the file is shut. Now something I measured rather than guessed. I walked 64 continuations out of this exact position, and in 56% of them that bishop on c1 goes to d2 anyway. The square Rajabov thinks he is winning was always going to be covered. In 89% of those lines his bishop on c8 has still not moved by the end, and white's rook on a1 has not moved either. His real move was the pawn to a4. The knight keeps eyeing f5, the other keeps eyeing e5, the pawn is coming to c4, and the bishop still owns c1 to h6. Bishop to b4 instead, and here the game quietly changes hands. That bishop was on the best square on the board. It leaves to hit d2 and e1, and all it achieves is a move white wanted anyway, while the bishop on c8 still has not moved. Knocking on a man's door to remind him to lock it is not a plan. Bishop to d2, exactly as I said, hitting before the moment it lands, knight on f5 duty, rook on the e-file. Rook back to a8. Pawn to c3, hitting the bishop again and covering d4 on the way, knight on f5, rook on the file. Bishop back to c5, which is where it was 3 moves ago, so 2 moves of Rajabov's life are gone. Pawn to d4, with tempo again, owning c5 and e5 and asking a question he does not want, knight on f5, rook on the file. This is Magnus. One small inaccuracy, and the bill arrives with interest, in installments, all afternoon. Bishop to b6, pawns come off in the middle, the new pawn taking d6 and f6 away with the rook behind it, and he recaptures. Now watch the move that wins this game, because it does not touch a single piece. Pawn to c4. This is the move the whole game is about, and it attacks nothing. It takes b5 and d5 away forever, it opens c3 for the bishop. And when it pushes on to c5, the piece sitting on b6 is finished. The knight keeps f5, the rook keeps the file. Alexander the Great took cities by taking the roads to them first. Knight to h7. Rajabov sees it coming and starts his only plan. The knight goes to f8, then e6, then d4, and on d4 it is a beautiful piece. It is 4 moves away. Magnus has 4 moves, and the bishop on c8 is still on c8. His other bishop wants d4 as well. Queen to e2, looking at d1 where the rook is going, holding e4 behind it, knight on f5 duty. Knight to f8, step 2. Bishop to e3, and now the knight cannot reach e6 at all. The bishop hits b6 through c5, it looks the other way to h6, the knight wants f5, the rook owns the file. Every square is being taken away one at a time and none of it looks like an attack. Tesla could light a bulb with no wire attached to it. Magnus is attacking a king with nothing near it. Pawn to c5. And Rajabov has locked his own bishop in the vault and posted the key. The bishop on b6 now has his own pawn on c5 in front of it and his own pawn on e5 on the other road, d6 and d4 are gone, and the only square left is a7. It is a security guard locked inside the vault he was hired to guard. His knight still wants e6, his other bishop is still on c8. Hawking said nothing escapes a black hole, not even light. Nothing escapes b6 either, and you will watch that bishop sit there for 20 more moves. Rook to d1, the last piece, straight down the file at the queen. The bishop keeps h6, the knight keeps f5, the rook keeps the e-file. That is your Avengers moment, everybody is here and nothing has happened yet. Queen to f6, off the file? Knight to h5, touching f6 and g7. Bishop on h6 duty, rook on d8. Suddenly there is a threat, and it came out of 10 moves where you saw nothing happen at all. The queen is being kicked, so many of you might think about queen to g6, keeping her active instead of shuffling backwards. Let me show you this variation. Queen to g6, and the other knight jumps to h4. A second attack on the same queen. And here, many might think queen takes the pawn on e4. Let me show you this too. It is free, she is being chased anyway, and grabbing something on the way out is what your hand does before your brain finishes. Queen takes e4, knight takes on g7, the king takes it back, bishop to h6 with check, the king takes that as well, and the queen falls. Over 7 pawns. 2 pieces for a queen, and a king out on h6 in the middle of the afternoon with g7, g5, h5 and h7 all covered. The white queen looks at h7, and eats e5 on the side, the knight comes to f5, the rook takes the d-file. Let us go back to the alternative variation. So the queen crawls to h7, queen to f3, pawn to f6, rook to d5, pawn to a4, knight to f5, the bishop takes it, and the pawn recaptures. Close to 4 pawns. From h7 that queen watches the rest of the game through a keyhole. The rook lands on d5 hitting e5 and owning the d-file to d8, the knight sits on f6, the bishop looks at h6, and all black has left in the world is a pawn taking on b3 on the other side of it. And now, back to the main game. Queen back to e7. The right decision, and it hurts to play. Knight to h2, heading for g4. Second thing I measured. Out of 64 continuations here, 2/3 put that knight on h2 and that rook on d3. Magnus plays both, 8 moves apart, and he is not calculating, he is doing what the position always wanted. Jackie Chan never throws the first punch either. The other knight keeps g7, the bishop keeps h6, the rook keeps the d-file. King to h7, spending a move to step off a diagonal and give up g8, and he has no move to spare. His bishop on c8 finally has something to look at on g4, his other bishop still wants d4. Queen to f3, looking all the way down to f7. It attacks and defends in one breath, because now the knight cannot come to e6, the queen would arrive on f5 with check. The knight still walks to g4, the other still holds g7, the bishop still looks at h6. And this is the moment that hurts, because for 6 moves that knight has walked from f6 to h7 to f8, and every step was booked for 1 square. Many of you might think about finally playing knight to e6. Let me show you this variation, what will happen when the plan arrives. Knight to e6, knight to g4, and the knight reaches d4. 6 moves of walking, and there it is. Rook takes the knight. A whole rook for it. And here, many might think take back with the e-pawn. Let me show you this too. It recaptures towards the center, it keeps your pawns connected, and it is the one your hand plays without asking. Pawn takes on d4, knight to f6 with check, king to h8, bishop takes on h6, the pawn takes back, and the queen swings to f4. Over 6 pawns. The e-file opens straight onto his own rook on e8, the queen hits h6 with nothing defending it, the knight on f6 already has that rook, the other knight covers g7, and one recapture with the wrong pawn, has doubled how bad this is. Let us go back to the alternative variation. So the c-pawn takes, knight to f6 with check, king to h8, bishop takes on h6, pawn takes back, and the knight collects the rook on e8. 3.5 pawns. He got his outpost and he held it for 1 move. The knight on e8 covers g7 and forks, c7 on the way, the other knight sits on f6, the queen looks down at f7, and his king has h8 and g8, and nothing else. In Romeo and Juliet the message arrives too late and everybody dies. This knight reached e6 on move 24. And now, back to the main game. Pawn to f6 instead, a wall in front of his king, and every wall you build in front of your own king is a square you can never use again. Knight to g4, hitting h6 and f6, the other knight on g7 and the bishop on the h6 road too. Now the knight can never go to e6 for a second separate reason. So Rajabov gives up his light-squared bishop for it. That bishop sat on c8 from the first move of the game. It never moved, it never touched 1 square, and the only thing it ever does is die on g4 hitting a queen. His knight is still dreaming of e6 and his rooks are still looking at each other. It was a fire extinguisher in a locked glass box, and the key was in the next room. Queen takes the knight. Taking with the pawn was better and Magnus does not care, because he wants her on g7 and d7. The knight covers f6, the bishop covers h6. Rook to d8, and that is the losing move. Pawn to g6 was still there, and after it he is passive, miserable and completely alive at 3/10 of a pawn. This keeps his position tidy for 1 more move. His rook eyes d1, his bishop eyes c5, his knight still dreams of e6, his rooks are doubled at last. And now the white queen steps 1 square closer, and she never leaves again. Queen to f5 with check. Now she can never be thrown out, because the pawn he pushed to f6 makes pawn to g6 illegal forever. She sees all the way to c8, the knight covers f6, the rook holds e4, and the king steps to h8 because there is nothing else. Pawn to f4. Time to open it, taking e5 and g5, queen still on f6 and rook still on d8. That queen has now sat 1 square from his king for 2 moves, so many of you might think about pawn to g6 and throwing her out. Let me show you this variation, what will happen if he chases her away. Pawn to g6, and the queen takes on f6 with check. She was never leaving. And here, many might think block with the queen. Let me show you this too. His queen goes to g7, his own king defends her, and it looks like the trade that saves everything. Queen to g7, and queen takes queen. That is mate, and the king cannot take back, because the knight that went to h5 9 moves ago covers g7. The queen sits next to him on h8, she takes the knight on f8 if she feels like it, and the rook has the file. That knight did nothing for 9 moves. DiCaprio waited 22 years for his Oscar. Let us go back to the alternative variation. So the queen recaptures, the knight takes her back, rooks come off, and off again, king to g7, the f-pawn takes on e5, pawn to a4, and the knight lands on d5. 3.5 pawns, and he is not even being mated, he is simply a piece short. The knight on d5 hits the bishop on b6 that has not moved since move 15, it covers f6 beside his king, the bishop looks at h6, and the rook owns the file. And now, back to the main game. Rooks come off instead. Pawn takes on f4, a horrible move to have to play, because it hands the bishop that square, and there was nothing else. His queen eyes e4, his knight eyes g6, his bishop has one square. Bishop takes on f4, and it looks down through d6 at c7. Queen still on f6, rook still on the file. Queen to e6, offering the trade, hitting f5 and e4. He is not threatening it, that endgame is hopeless, he is asking politely. His knight still wants g6, his bishop still has a7. Rook to d3. No capture, no check, no threat you can name. It gets ready to swing along the third rank to g3, it keeps the whole d-file, the bishop looks at h6 and the queen at f6, and it leaves every decision to the man on the other side of the board. 3/4 of every line I walk from here has that rook on d3, and 7 in 10 still have his bishop parked on b6. Akbar built an empire with weddings instead of wars, and everybody signed. Rook to e8. His rook steps off the g-file, his queen still hits f5, his knight still wants g6, and there is nothing at all left on g7. That is all Magnus was waiting for. Knight takes on g7. He wins no material with this. He is buying the roof off the house. A knight is 3 pawns. What comes off the board is the shell over h8, h7 and g8, all opened at once. And while it stands there it forks the rook on e8, and the queen on e6. The queen is going to h5, the rook is going to g3, the bishop already looks at h6. Amitabh Bachchan walks in for the last 20 minutes and the film is his. King takes knight, because everything else loses on the spot. Queen to h5, and the pawn on h6 falls with check. She also sees e8 down the other road, the bishop hits h6 too, the rook is coming to g3, the file is still hers. His king has h7 and no help. Now count the material honestly, because this is the part you will get wrong. Rajabov is a whole piece up. He has an extra bishop and every white attacker is already in position, while that bishop watches from another postcode. Knight to h7, the only defense, his queen still hits e4, his knight still covers f8, his bishop still has a7. Bishop takes on h6 with check. It looks through g7 at f8, it holds the whole diagonal to c1, the queen steps to g6 next, the rook still wants g3. King to h8. Queen to g6, and this is the finesse of the whole game. She touches g7 and h7, the bishop covers g7 underneath her, the rook owns the file, and she stares at the rook on e8. Mate on g7 is coming, and there is one move that looks like defending. Many of you might think about rook to g8, putting the rook on the very square that is about to be mated on. Let me show you this variation, what will happen if he defends the way you would. Rook to g8, and rook to d8. Not a check, not a capture, completely quiet, it attacks a rook that is not allowed to stay and not allowed to leave. He takes it, and the queen steps onto g7. That is mate. The bishop on h6 holds her there, the king has h8 and g8 and she covers both, his own knight blocks h7, and his rook is 8 squares away on d8 where it was sent. Leave that rook alone and the mate still lands, 4 moves at the outside, and it hurts more. Shakespeare killed everybody in the last act too. And now, back to the main game. Queen to g8 instead, and the rook is simply lost. Bishop to g7 with check, touching f8 and sitting next to the king on h8, rook on the file, queen aimed at e8. The queen has to take it, queen takes rook with check, and now she covers h8 and runs the 8th rank to a8, rook still on d8, and ready to swing to g3. Queen to f8 is forced, queen to e6, hitting g8 and e8, rook on the file and still ready for g3. The attack has not stopped, and there is nothing left to attack with. Queen to h6. Pawn to e5, the last nail. It takes f6 and d6 away, it opens the road to c8, the rook still owns d8 and still has g3. Kalam said dream is not what you see in sleep, it is what does not let you sleep. 2 spike checks, and rook to g3. That rook now runs at g8, the queen hits g8 and e8 from the other side, the king has h8, and h7 and neither of them is a square, and he must give up the knight to stop mate. So Rajabov resigns here, on move 40. So look at what happened to you today. Not one piece was ever hanging, not one pawn was ever loose. Magnus won this game with pawn to c4 on move 17, and the knight on move 31 was only the receipt. Edison tested 1,000 filaments before one of them lit, and Rajabov had one plan and tried it for 6 moves. Take one thing away, your bad bishop is only bad if you put your own pawns in front of it. Subscribe, and I will show you another one.